Fantasy-animation.org is a website with a difference. It is not for profit, and it's run entirely by academics and professional animators. And this means that whether you are reading our latest blog or accessing our latest podcast, thanks for downloading by the way, you can be sure that you are getting the most up-to-date and informed commentary on the colliding worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Whether you are a budding animator yourself, a student of fantasy or animation, or just someone who wants to learn more about the history and theory behind these overlapping media, mediums and genres, why not find out more at fantasy-animation.org or subscribe to our various social media threads on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Reddit, at fananimresearch, FANANIM research. While you're at it, subscribe to the podcast, give us a star rating, and better yet, a quick written review as well. It all helps to make the visibility of our project even stronger and attract more like-minded people like yourself to our growing network of fans. For now, do enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I am Alex Sargent.
And I am Chris Holliday.
This week we're doing something a little bit different, Chris. We're not doing a film or a filmmaker, but I guess in a way a kind of subcontinent. So there's a lot to talk about in the next hour. We're going to sort of do a little introduction to Sub-Saharan African animation, which is a really rich, wonderful topic that I knew nothing about 5 days ago and have had the pleasure of watching a few movies. For me, as a fantasy theorist, travelling sort of to a new continent which you don't have expertise is really kind of interesting but fraught with some issues. You know, what is a fantasy in a different culture? How can we map one understanding of kind of folklore or onto another understanding which might have very different cultural and historical traditions? They might have very different attitudes to ideas of the supernatural, to ideas of reality. So I've got a lot of things to think through in this episode. How about you, Chris?
Yep, I'm really interested in the sort of, I guess something we've touched on to some extent, the sort of core periphery model. I think this informs actually the topic of today's podcast, sort of informs or shapes or relates to the way that we think about what things to do on the podcast and trying quite closely and hopefully with some consideration to think about animation as an artistic practice and a set of context, industrial context, social context, political context outside of sort of the West. So that the sort of cross-section of animated examples that we've got to go through today, I think, offer some really interesting nooks and crannies into certainly a history that I wasn't familiar with. And just before we came on, you said me and you are most definitely the Luddites in the room. So we can definitely defer to our special guest on this one.
So we're the Luddites. Let's introduce the person that actually knows what they're talking about.
Yes.
We are very privileged today to be joined by Dr Paula Callus, who is an associate professor at the University of Bournemouth. Paula works on Sub-Saharan African animation in a variety of different forms. She's published widely on the subject in a number of academic journals and publications. And she also recently worked on the UNESCO Africa Animated project, which is a 5-week residency supporting Pan-African animation based in East Africa. Paula's really a wonderful person to at least give listeners who might not be familiar with this really rich but diverse landscape of animation at least a little bit of an introduction to it. So Paula, thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Thanks, Alex. I'm looking forward to it.
So yeah, me too. We've got lots to cover, and I think we should say as an outset, this isn't meant to be any kind of authoritative flag in the sand about what animation looks like in this area, but it's merely intended as a kind of little snapshot, perhaps of future episodes or future projects or things like that. So I guess as a means of an introduction, Paula, you've provided us with a list today, which I'm really excited to get to. But before we start, why don't you just take us through the sort of the story of how you became interested in this area of animation? You know, most early animators, at least in the West, UK and Europe and America, kind of are grown up on a certain Western canon. It's very easy to maintain one's fascination with that canon. But where did your journey into Sub-Saharan African animation start?
Okay, so my journey started when I was doing my postgraduate studies in computer animation. And I'm Maltese, and I was studying in the UK, so I hung out with the international students, and one of my closest friends was a Nigerian animator who studied with me. And we were just talking about how at the time a lot of the literature in the field around animation studies had a very Western-centric perspective, which meant there was absolutely hardly any information about animation from other parts of the world, namely in his case talking about animation in the Sub-Saharan context, me in Malta, and our other friends likewise from other parts of the world. Most of the literature we were coming across was by scholars who were focusing on animation in America and in the UK at the time. Obviously, we were looking at English language books as opposed to, for example, literature in Francophone kind of contexts, which present different histories. So that's kind of where it started, off the back of conversations with my friends. I got a job at Bournemouth University, and by fluke put up on my list of interests on my staff profile page was, other types of animation, such as African animation. And I got invited by UNESCO to go and contribute to the development of a residency program as a, let's say, education consultant. So that was the start, where I got to meet people from Pan-African context. So they were flown into Kenya, and we sat around the table and we spoke about how UNESCO wanted to create content for the, at that time, East African region, which was not defined by language and therefore portable across different countries in that region. And my job was to go and work with artists and teach them animation.
Terrific.
Do you want me to go on? I can't go on.
So, what happened next then? Finish the story.
Well, basically, what happened next is obviously I came across a whole rich sort of network of artists and people who were making work, and and hearing stories about traditions and trajectories of practice that, weren't just, if you like, in the moment, wasn't just in the year 2000, but had existed since the 1960s. So it suggested to me that there were long histories of animation in these places. And I felt like, okay, this is something I need to look into more. So I went to SOAS to do another postgraduate degree in anthropology of media to equip me with the skills, if you like, that I needed to best understand what I was looking at.
I haven't asked, and I did this thing quite often as I ask what I know is an impossible question, but I make usually Chris answer it anyway. But I might give you a go today, Paula, if you'll be generous enough. And just before we start, you talk about this need to tell the story of this kind of I guess neglected area of focus, to dispel myths about what people think Sub-Saharan African animation is. So I thought, if you can. This is the impossible question before we start with the first part, with the examples to kind of put this into practice. What should people who perhaps have no knowledge or prior knowledge, perhaps they've grown up watching nothing but popular Western animation, and just because they like animation and they want to see something new, they might be interested in seeing some of the examples we're going to talk about today. Is there anything they should know about the story of Sub-Saharan African that might help them to access these materials? Or indeed, is there a way of sort of helping them dispel some of the myths before they start watching them that you would recommend? Is there any kind of do's or don'ts?
So ways to access the work I found, and it's based on my own ideas about animation, because I see animation as this sort of coherence of different artistic practices that come together. So for me, whenever I'm looking at animation from different countries in Africa, I also look at their visual culture. I look at what kind of images painters might be making, what kind of books or novels are written about these places, what kind of stories are told, what kind of sculptures are made, what kind of dances people dance, and all of this sort of informs, because an animator will, especially if they come from a fine art background or a background as a practicing artist, they'll draw from that. And when you're looking at those things, then you can understand better the animation that you're looking at. You can understand the visual culture within which it might exist and where it comes from. So that's always a good starting point. And obviously, I mean, for me, like a myth that maybe we'll get to talk about at the end is that, it was actually a really beautiful thing, which an animator in Kenya had said to me, who went on, he did like CGI animation. He made an animation, and then he made an animated like 3D game, which was like a shoot 'em up game. So you were basically defending Nairobi, and Nairobi was invaded by aliens. And the thing he said to me was, why do aliens never come to Africa? Right. And that was like his question, sort of really stuck in my mind, that nobody thinks of Africa as belonging to the future. It's always spoken of as kind of belonging to the past. And so that's like, I think, what hopefully, especially if you're looking at what young animators are making now, it's very contemporary, it's very future looking, and it's very global, as well. Everybody's connected nowadays, so they're drawing from influences from loads of different places.
Yeah, well, I think that your notion of framing, this a lot of things are what we collectively believe them to be, and the power of the imaginary when it comes to the, as you say, the us and them relationships. And certainly I think undergraduate students in lots of different ways might have an assumption. I'm thinking of universities that have courses about third cinema or topics in world cinema, and the way that actually sometimes that can shore up some of these assumptions that we would have about animation or filmmaking in certain parts of the world. And actually the films that so this is a good a time as any to talk about them, but as I was watching the films that you suggested, I was thinking, my goodness, these are going to slip perfectly into my animation course. If future students listening to this won't be surprised that now some of these that you suggested will make their way into the course, because I was thinking these are really interesting spaces and sites to think through kind of notions of difference of the other, as you've written about in your work, ways of reading gender and so forth. So I'm notions of the skin, like I'm really interested and excited to go through these and that run the gamut from sort of stuff from the 60s to television programs where I was convinced it was Lenny Henry as the voice, and I was right.
From the 60s to Lenny Henry is a good point for us to start this journey. So
we're off.
Listeners, you can find the list on our website. You can find it on the synopsis. Please watch along with us. But let's start with the first one. I'm going to ask Paula to give us a quick synopsis and explanation for why she's chosen each one. But the first one is an animation from 1966, I believe, entitled Bon Voyage Sim.
So Bon Voyage Sim. Sim is the name of the frog. And Bon Voyage Sim is made by an animator called Moustapha Alassane from Niger. And he made this film, so the date is quite important. 1966 is just after Niger had won its independence. And I chose this animation as Moustapha Alassane is referred to as the father of Sub-Saharan African animation. So it's kind of a go-to animation if you were looking at Sub-Saharan African animation, a place to start in talking about the history, especially because, of course, it exists in a post-colonial context. So it's possible to find examples of animations made in a sub-Saharan context in archives, but those tended to be made in cooperation or collaboration with the colonizer, and usually for didactic or educational purposes. So they're there to teach people about things. And this is the first one, which is also political and satirical, which I don't know if you picked up on it. So it's a little animation about a president frog or toad called Sim. And he gets invited to go and visit a neighboring country, and he visits a neighboring country and he meets all these other dignitaries and opens a university and other buildings, goes to important meetings, is celebrated, and flies back home. So obviously it's satirical in that it's making fun of the pomp and grandeur that was around the newly appointed African leaders and these big ceremonies that happened when people were being made president.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. I loved it. It was a cheeky masterpiece. I thought it was a really witty film, and I didn't think the first thing I would say about one of these movies, again, let's dispel myths, was that it was going to be really witty and funny, and that would be my overriding impression. But I absolutely picked up on well, at least that the sort of anti-authoritarian message of it all, and I loved how the animation. It reminded, I'm afraid me and Chris are almost certainly going to do this throughout the episode, which is we're going to compare it to Western examples because that's our frame of reference. But it reminded me of when we did an episode on rhubarb and custard about sort of limited animation as a tool to be kind of anti-authoritarian. Almost the aesthetic of it is because it's quite imperfect and feels quite homemade. It works very well to kind of as a tool to express the feelings of the underdog or and it definitely, I felt, worked really well for this. So yeah, I really like this one. Yeah,
that's right. It's a line. I mean, it's a line drawing. It has no color. It's black and white, simple lines. And like you've identified, it's very economical. It uses and reuses animated loop sequences. When I wrote about this, some European animation historians described it as naive, but I would dispute that and say there are small segments in that where you can see that the animator is very skilled and knows what they're doing. And in fact, this economy is more down to access to resources at the time and what was available for the filmmaker. So obviously, I mean, that's true actually for most animation. Animation is always about economy. Animators are always looking for short, quick ways to make work. So yeah, it's I think really, really special. And it's extra special. I mean, I didn't give you this information. I wasn't sure if you'd find out about it. But for me, there's a little kind of backstory, which makes it really fascinating and interesting. So Voyage was made in 1966, and in 2001, I came across, through a friend of mine who knew the filmmaker, I came across the same version of the film called Adieu Sim. So Bon Voyage is like, have a good trip, and Adieu is goodbye. And it was a remake of the film, exactly the same thing, done using a computer, so very crudely, painted, pixel painted in. Exactly the same, shot for shot. But the ending was different. So in the end of this version of the film, when the toad flies back home, he flies back home to discover his country had been invaded by an army. And so I couldn't help but wonder whether the filmmaker had always intended to tell that story, where the toad came back and discovered his country had been taken over by this army. And if he didn't, why didn't he tell that story? So I did a bit of fishing around to try and find out who funded the film. And it was the French Cultural Office at the time that was based in Niger that had funded the film, so the 1966 film. And of course, as you can appreciate, given that it was just after colonialism, the French still had a vested interest in controlling and keeping their hand, if you like, in Niger. And they did that by having these cultural offices where they worked with filmmakers, and if you like, enabled them to make films. So you can't help but think whether this version of the film is a tempered story, given that he knew who was funding, with the French. So it speaks a bit as well about the politics of the relationships between an artist, making work in the 1960s just off the back of colonialism and their relationship to the colonizer.
Well, exactly, and it made me think. And actually, when Alex was mentioning the sort of the crudeness of it, or the reactionary element that is manifest through form, I had sort of two hats on. The first one was how that feeds into my understanding and the week that one does on undergraduate level when you teach students about the kind of the politics of an imperfect cinema and all of the discourses around a kind of cinema that was shown and exhibited, made in a different way, exhibited in a different way, was more imperfect, and the sort of the reactionary politics to that kind of cinema that is made outside of a studio system, and how this film felt very much of that, and therefore I was thinking, well, is that just me reading in the myth of radical politics and resistance into a set of films, or into a film that is of a particular kind at a particular time? But as you said, that it is very easy and rightly so to read that kind of post-colonial legacy as it plays out in these earlier films, because it is coming at the specific historical juncture. And then I was thinking about the way that backgrounds work in this film, and you said that there's a kind of economy that animation comes out. It is always about economy. And I was thinking about Japanese anime, where you have these, certainly Astro Boy in the 50s and 60s, where you have these backgrounds that that aren't animated. You're essentially just putting the background behind the character to create the illusion of movement.
Exactly.
And on the one hand, it's the assumption is that it's an economic imperative. It reduces costs. You aren't having to animate the background, and you also are using broad, sweeping lines to suggest speed and power and movement and motion. But there's also a visual imperative here, reducing character movement between the poses, leaving things open to the spectator's imagination. And so I liked the way that this film, it wasn't just crude and imperfect, and that's it. There was something else to its aesthetic style, and actually the role of sound. The sound does an awful lot of the work in the film. So,
yes, I agree.
Yeah,
I think it sounds excellent.
Yeah.
So for me, I should mention as well, Moustapha Alassane worked with Jean Rouch. So I don't know if you're familiar with Jean Rouch, the ethnographic filmmaker, and he also got trained by Norman McLaren, who's a Scottish animator. So, it's not like he wouldn't have had the knowledge or the know-how, which obviously then takes you to the next step, which is where I went, which is, what are the resources available to people making animated things at the time. So for me, given that he was making it on his own, with limited funds and so on and so forth, then for me it was not a question of skill, but a question of resources.
There's also just that, we try and fight against it when we do other things on this podcast, of that, just because there's a certain mentality that is that animation needs to both look and be expensive, that expensive animation is good and less expensive animation is bad, and why would you ever make something that doesn't look expensive if you could, when actually or that it can't be enjoyable. Absolutely.
As well. And I think this is a really good example of something that is extremely, if you want to talk about it aesthetically, let's say simple. It doesn't have color, it doesn't have complicated background, there's no degree of detail in texture or rendition, and yet it's so effective and so funny. Its timing, I think it has really good comedic timing. And with when he gives his little talk to the ministers around the table, and they all get up and do a little clap, and then they talk. And the great thing is, whenever I show that, people always say, it's great because you don't even need to understand French to know what they're doing. It's so readable, even if you're not, picking up exactly the words of what the characters are saying.
It's funny that you mentioned McLaren because, I don't know whether we're moving on to the second one. I had a note about McLaren for the second film that you showed around McLaren's treatment of live action bodies and the way that he kind of animates live action bodies. But
why don't that's a well done, Chris. That's a good segue.
You are welcome.
Or it'll do till the good segue gets here. Let's move on to the second one. So we're the other few are from the last 20 years or so, aren't they? So we're going to jump a few decades now. So why don't you talk us through the second one, Yellow Fever?
Okay, so Yellow Fever is a film made by a Kenyan animator called Ngendo Mukii, who I had the pleasure of meeting and working with when I was doing my fieldwork in Kenya, in Nairobi. And it's actually her graduation piece, which she made when she was studying at the RCA in London. So when I met her, it was before she went to London to study, and she had been making animations already in Nairobi, working for a company. Anyway, so yellow fever is, I guess maybe described, I've written about it, unspoken about it as, let's say, a form of visual testimony. It's presented with her own voice, so she kind of enters into the topic that she calls yellow fever, but it's actually about skin bleaching products and how skin bleaching products are prolific in her case, she's talking about in the context of Kenya, but as we know, it's also widely used in other geographies around the world. And of course, as well, then speaks to bigger questions about identity and color of one's skin, and the preference to be whiter and what that means, and the pressures that women feel in Africa, I should say, as well. So, women feel in Kenya to be lighter or to have lighter skin. And these products which they use, of course, which are extremely damaging.
I have to, and this is with apologies to Lenny Henry, but this was my favourite. This was, I think there is so much in here. And I was trying to write down, I've got notes when she's talking about borders and hierarchies of beauty, and some quite, the dialogue is quite unequivocal. She is chocolate, I am coffee. Talking about the persistence of true ebony and melatonin and kind of it and the way that the film uses animation to tell that story and visualize quite stark images. I think the moment where she's talking about the person braiding their hair and the different color of her face and hands because she wasn't able to bleach her whole body, and so there's some.
That's right.
Yeah. So the animation is very good at visualizing these sorts of memories, and obviously long histories of animation's relationship to things like catharsis and trauma and memory, most of which I think happens within perhaps the field of animated documentary, of which this perhaps has a flavour. But reading the description on the link that you sent, where the artist, the animator, talks about being interested in the implications of skin and race, and I love this idea of ideas that are sewn into flesh, which makes perfect sense given how animated characterization has to do and how it works, what it has to do, and a lot of, I guess, writing on animation and the body as metaphor seems really well suited to a topic whereby ideas are sewn into the flesh to create what the artist calls this kind of homogeneity of beauty. My note on McLaren is really about the live action footage within the film. So the film moves between this live action and animated footage. Starts with animation, I think, and then moves outwards. And there are McLaren's film Neighbours that uses live action footage but treats it like animation, so frame by frame, so that these human characters are really jerky in the way that they move. And I got a sense of that from some of the bits where you have this sort of performer dancing quite expressively, and then you move into a series of close-ups, and the body seems to contort in a way that it's treated like it was animation. And there's something which, of course, again feeds perfectly into these fantasies of control, which link to questions of identity that obviously the film is about. So I thought there was loads. I mean, it reminded me of that recent film Hair Love, that I think won the Oscar for best short. But yeah, I thought there was loads going in there, and it's going to slip straight into my animation module because I thought it was such a rich and a way of thinking through. I think students and for us as scholars thinking through questions of our identity and race and performance, I think. But yeah, Alex, what are your thoughts on the movie?
Yeah, I had a note on fantasy on this one in the
classic Sergeant.
That's what I'm here for. In the I thought it both reminded me and didn't remind me of discussions we've had on the podcast about animation as a tool for subjective expression, and quite often when we're talking about that, we're referencing theorists who kind of make this connection between fantasy and animation as good tools to express the subjective, because it is anti-material and therefore kind of more emotional in its kind of language. And we've cited scholars like Catherine Hume in the past and Jane Pilling, who use Freudian psychoanalysis or histories of romanticism to try and make that connection between fantasy and animation and subjectivity. And to me, what didn't remind me of all that was just the palpable sense of alienation almost that came across in the aesthetic, in that it felt, when these theorists talk about the power of animation and fantasy to kind of express that which is within us, usually that's quite an optimistic narrative, because it's quite like, and we can finally be ourselves in that kind of, Western, I guess what Chris was saying, powers of control. Whilst this felt very much like, almost like the animation has a certain ironic or bitter or acrid sensibility to it, and it's almost about the kind of trappings of a person unable to self-actualize because of the external world. And I guess we could make some glib references to things like Franz Fanon, White Masks, and all that kind of stuff. But really, I think it's just the animation has this incredible bittersweet quality to it. Because of that, you just feel like you're one step removed from this person's interiority, and yet so inside it at the same time, that I just thought was really quite, beautiful. I think we'll move on to the next one then, and this is the first of two to be based on, or nominally based on West African folk stories, I believe. So I'm on board. Why don't you tell us about the next one?
Okay, so the next animation is by Kenneth Coker. And actually now he goes more by the name Shof Coker, or Shofela. You'll be able to find his work online. He's a great illustrator, and he does sci-fi, fantasy graphic novels as well. So his piece Iwa is based on Yoruba mythology, and it's based on actually a story written by Wole Soyinka, who's a Nigerian novelist. And it's the story of it's a creationist myth, and it's about the story of one of Yoruba gods called Olaran, and one of the artisans in the city of gods in the sky, who was tasked with basically protecting this sacred grove. And the artisan, if you like, rebels, and then gets punished by Olaran and banished from the sky down to earth. But there are different versions, let's say, of this story. And also, this animation is also quite, let's say, loose in its interpretation of the story as well. So it allows for different ways of reading what the story is. So sometimes people might think that the character that is banished to earth is also a reference to Shango, who is a king in Yoruba mythology that was banished to earth as well. So there are different references. It's quite multi-layered. Yeah. It's also made in CGI, which I think is important. And well, I don't know. You tell me what you think, and I'll add to it.
I suppose I wrote visualization, and I was thinking about some of the other areas on the podcast. Maybe we've chatted about animation's ability to represent the unrepresentable. And now I can't quite remember, but Lily Husbands, who is a friend of the podcast and has written a chapter in the fantasy animation book, has written about an animated duo called Semiconductor, and they sort of visualize in one of their films involves the visualization of forces and kind of kinetic force and things magnetic forces, things that you can't see, and it takes magnetic force and these sorts of energy fields and turns them into animation. So you have a shot of a lab, and then you have these spirals of color and so forth that emanate from particular kinds of equipment. And the idea is that animation can visualize this sort of phenomenon. And I had it reminded me of that, the idea of visualizing growth, the story of personal struggle, but also the body as the site of force. And there's something around the digital perhaps that lends itself quite well to that sort of image. So there's a few shots where the body is aligned with these sort of jets or pulses of energy, and I felt like that the CGI went really nicely together. This would be a very different film if it was claymation, for example. There was something immaterial, or there was something quite intangible about the CGI and what it was doing in relation to constructing this because I think I read the title translates as strength of character, and I read that more as body as this site of force, and whether or not the CG works really nicely to that. So I only have a few notes on that, because when I saw it was based on a myth, I thought Alex is going to get all excited and start.
So, I mean, maybe to help or add to that, it is the second of actually 2 films that were made. So there is a film that was made a year earlier called Oni Ise Owu. So it's actually the same story, but it's more like a 2D kind of cutout graphical animation. So you can watch the story, if you like, and compare it in 2 different ways, which is quite interesting as well, just to think of how it's being rendered. One which is more like looks very much like a pattern or motif in textile. And this one, of course, which is completely very 3D, and actually really, I think, uses a 3-dimensional space very well. In terms of just the cinematography and how the action is staged and how it takes place. But yeah, maybe Alex has some thoughts.
Well, the only thing I have to say about the myth is that I think, you know, in the Western tradition at least, it seems to be that folk stories are very often used because everyone knows the story, and it means the animator doesn't have to invest too much in the telling, and they can get on with the kind of fun that surrounds the telling, or I guess doesn't have to invest that much in the tale, but in the telling might be a better way of thinking about it. And usually that means the folk story itself, for those of us who are interested in that stuff, gets kind of simplified and made less nuanced, because actually the animator isn't ultimately interested in exploring whether the heroine of a particular Germanic folk tale thinks this way or that way, but is just interested in kind of the opportunities for visualization. Whilst here, I thought that, kind of as you said in your introduction, Paul, I thought that the way the story was told through the animation allowed for all these interesting kind of, there's a lot of repetition in the imagery, which plays into the repetition of the story, and that, you know, characters give birth to other characters that give birth to characters, and there's a kind of cyclical narrative going on that's repeated in the kind of visuals of characters kind of bursting other characters into life. And it allows for kind of multiplicities of viewpoint. I hadn't thought about this idea that you said, that you could watch it and view it many different ways. And it's certainly the most, I guess, for want of a boring term, experimental of the 5 you've picked out, or at least the most narratively ambiguous of the 5 that you've
That's right. So this film was made, again, he was doing his graduate studies in illustration in the US at the time. So I was interested in how he takes this Yoruba myth. So Yoruba being, for those of you not familiar with Nigerian geography, is southwest. So the Yoruba are a group of people that typically live in the southwest of Nigeria. And they have a lot of different, actually, creationist myths with various different gods, Oluron being one of them. And being the most important. So that would be the character, Alex, that you refer to, that breathes life into the artisan. And he's known as the owner of the sky, but he also is thought of as being responsible for, if you were born with a deformity, he would be the god that would be responsible for that. So he's the bringer of life, but also of bad things. So for me, like Kenneth or Shof's work is super interesting because when I interviewed him about this film, what became more obvious as we were talking about aesthetically what was going on is that it isn't necessarily directly located in an aesthetic that sits within southern Nigeria. So in fact, the architecture, for example, is referencing a mosque in Mali. And he looked at people like Lottie Reininger's films with the silhouette animation. And he was also looking at, I don't know if you know Luis Barragan, he's a Mexican architect. So he makes these beautiful kind of outdoor pieces of architecture that look at the interplay of light with very simple forms. So and Evan Earl, for example, who does the backgrounds in Disney's Sleeping Beauty with the trees. So all of his influences came from a whole range of different places. And I feel that's why it's one of these pieces that speaks to audiences in different geographies. So you could be Nigerian and you would be able to recognize or identify with elements of this story. But it isn't uniquely, if you like, or firmly located in an aesthetic or a visual space that is, this is Yoruba, visual tradition. Because it allows for the viewer to really take away very different things when you look at it. It's very metaphorical in many different ways. When you look at it, even if you didn't know about Oloran and Yoruba mythology, you would still understand the notion of creation and falling from the sky and then giving life to the tree at the end, which for me as well, when I was watching that and then I looked at Pumzi, I just thought, oh, that's uncanny because Pumzi ends with a very similar ending.
Spoiler alert! Oh, spoiler!
Yeah, sorry.
Well, to be perverse, should we do Pumzi now, seeing as you mentioned it, and then we will literally be saving Lenny Henry till last in this kind of Kurtz. He can remain like a Kurtz-esque figure as we sort of carry down the river. Let's do Pumzi.
Okay. So Pumzi is. I have to be careful. I've even made notes about this because I don't want to get it wrong. Pumzi is described as an Afrofuturist short film. I would say described because it's something that the writer and director Wanuri Kahiu disputes. So she's a Kenyan writer, filmmaker as well. And maybe this is something we can talk about a bit more about how the term Afrofuturism is for her problematic, but that's how it's described. We could also talk about it as a science fiction film. And in this story, the story takes place in the future after World War III in an East African region where a community of people, if you like, live in a self-sustaining or self-sustainable pod, I guess. I might describe it like that. And there's one key character called Asha who comes across evidence of life on the outside and tries to seek out this life, which comes to her through dreams as a tree, as this image of a tree. And obviously water as well is very important, as an important kind of element in this film. Is that a good summary? What did you say?
That's great. Yeah, and I didn't know I didn't know it was described as Afrofuturist. That's not what came to mind for me. I'd like to hear more about why that term perhaps is worth problematizing. But obviously, on a kind of categorical level, this doesn't seem to me very Afrofuturist in that it's not optimistic about the future in any way, shape, or form. Right? It's a dystopic narrative. We should say this is a nominally live action of the five. This is the only one that's nominally mainly live action with VFX.
Yeah, thanks for that.
and it's a character, and it's a story about a character that literally has to take dream suppressors. Like, that's how bleak the kind of rhetoric is of dystopic. So on that level, I can completely see why you would object to it being called an Afrofuturist. But there's something beyond that.
Yeah, so Afrofuturism is a term that came about in the 1990s, and it's used actually to refer to films that interweave, if you like, African diaspora culture, I mean, if there is such a thing, right, with science fiction. But it emerged, if you like, in the States. So recently, I say recently, let's say in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of talk about how the term Afrofuturist has been reclaimed by African filmmakers. So again, not the diaspora, but how do you take that word and what does it mean to an African filmmaker? Because of course, when it was conceived of in the 1990s, it was used in a very different context to refer to a very different thing. But in the case of this film director, she also kind of has a problem with the term in that what it does in her mind is it basically, again, labels something. And she is quite vocal about not wanting to be labeled as an African filmmaker, right? She is a filmmaker, or rather what she likes saying is, I'm a storyteller, and sort of leave it at that. Because, of course, that brings about what we were talking about at the beginning, a set of, ideas in people's minds about what things should or shouldn't look like, or what they should and shouldn't be. That said, it's, loads of people do refer to it as Afrofuturist, and so I felt I had to mention that.
Well, the specificity of Mark Derry coining Afrofuturism within the context of America, I'd not kind of registered in the way that, because I've been doing a bit of reading around sort of Alex mentioned it's a little less optimistic, so I've been reading about Afro-pessimism and essentially that as a counter category. So the idea that just because you take black identity, combine it with science fiction, and when you use that to sort of plot a hypothetical or an empowered black subjectivity, there are ways in which you can combine black identity and science fiction and err on the side of Afro-pessimism. So writing that or a framework that engages with the instrumentalizing of blackness, that talks about the ongoing effects of racism and colonialism. There was a flavour of that in this film, because there wasn't that much animation beyond a few kind of holograms and nominal effects and things like that. But I was thinking again about ideas of control and whether or not Afrofuturism is the one side of the coin, but there is certainly a long-standing. Let me just find. Reading. Blacks do not function as political subjects. Instead, our flesh and energies are instrumentalized for post-colonial, immigrant, feminist, LGBT, and workers' agendas. And there's something the other side here of Afrofuturism that I think maybe the film taps into in a slightly different way. So that was a quote, Frank B. Wilderson III, a way of interpreting a certain society's ongoing dependence on anti-black violence. And there was something in the film that perhaps chimed with some of those kinds of definitions. It's certainly an idea that's new to me, because I think the assumption when we did the Black Panther episode, we kind of talked quite positively and wonderfully about Afrofuturism, but there's something else going on here in that alignment with black subjectivity and science fiction, which the film sort of the end with the tree. And
if sorry, this is just a small side plug, but if you're interested in
plug away
in a kind of satirical kind of parody of Afrofuturism, there's a artist collective called The Nest in Kenya. And they have this really funny skit with this artist who is parodying the idea of Afrofuturism is really in, and basically it's what the West wants from us. So if we just do stuff that's Afrofuturist, we're all right, kind of thing. So
interesting. Us and them.
Yes, always.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
So on the subject of myths and co-productions and the compromised politics of working with a Western partner.
Now there's a segue.
This teases up our final choice, Tinga Tinga Tales, which the episode we should say, I'll let Paula set up what this is.
So, Tinga Tinga Tales is an animated series. If your listeners are based in the UK, they probably might have watched 1 or 2 episodes, especially if they have children. It was on the BBC. And it was produced by a British animation company called Tiger Aspect. The producer's called Claudia Lloyd, and she was responsible for animations like Charlie and Lola and Mr. Bean. So those animated series. But what's interesting is this animation was made by animators in Kenya. So, and the artists and designers were Tanzanian. And it takes, let's say, African folklore, I'm going to say in inverted commas, stories of how certain animals came to be. So in this instance, it's how did the elephant get its trunk? How did the tortoise get its shell? How did the lion get its roar? Etc., etc., etc. And so when I was doing my research, some of the people I had worked with on the UNESCO project went on to work at the animation studios based in Nairobi. It was a really important, actually, event to happen in Nairobi because it cohered a lot of young Kenyan animators together. And it was the first big production to be made in Kenya. So it had that significance. It's also significant for me because around it at the time, there were lots of polemics about ownership. So for me, I was interested in cultural, or this idea of ownership around culture and heritage. And so to explain this a little bit more, when you watch Tinga Tinga Tales and you're looking at the characters and the way the characters are drawn and designed, the word Tinga Tinga comes from an arts cooperative based in Tanzania, which was set up by a Tanzanian artist called Edward Saidi Tinga Tinga. And he was making paintings in the 1960s. And then there's this whole cooperative of artists that make these Tinga Tinga paintings. So Tinga Tinga paintings have a very easily recognizable style, a very defined style, and they always, for the most part, I'd say nearly all the ones I've seen, depict animals. And they have repetitious motifs, they tend to be mirrored, they tend to be patterned in particular ways. And the painter who made the paintings used bicycle paint to make the paintings because he was able to apply thin lines without the underlying colors coming through. So if you saw a Tinga Tinga painting and you were an animator or someone who worked in animation, you'd be forgiven for thinking, wow, these would make brilliant animated characters, because you could just see quite clearly how that could map over into animation. And the story goes that the producer was learning Swahili in Tanzania. She had bought a few paintings herself and then thought, yeah, this is something that could be made into an animated series. She looked at stories like this African folklore that, how an animal did this, how an animal did that, which were out of copyright. And then that became the basis for the series. The episode that we've watched is on how the elephant got its trunk. But what I was extra amused by was, in fact, I don't know if you guys knew this, the story on how the elephant got its trunk was written by Rudyard Kipling, who wrote The Jungle Book. And then, you begin to start thinking again around questions of authenticity and identity And well, where does this story come from, and who's telling the story, and whose story is it?
I liked this. It was fun. I would happily do a whole, podcast about it. I think it was a fun a show. I thought it was visually beautiful. It was nice to hear about the sort of context around the art. I knew I saw in my research about the Tinga art and how it came from. I thought the design was beautiful. I don't have that much. I thought it was witty again, so it's nice to draw back on witty. We started with witty. I thought it was extremely witty. The Rudyard Kipling thing I had noticed, so that's an interesting thing. I believe that's probably one of his Just So stories in that case. So that's, an appropriation of Indian mythology turned into a sort of cozy Western narrative, then transplanted and given to Africa. The politics of that are bonkers, but worth flagging up so people can unpack. The only thing, I guess, we haven't got a huge amount of time left. I mean, should we say anything? We have said that Lenny Henry is in it about 80 times.
Have we?
There's a strange vocal casting in that most of the cast, I believe, are British.
American as well. American.
Right, yeah, okay.
Only one or two Kenyan voice actors. The little boy, so the red monkey is voiced by a boy, a Kenyan boy. And in fact, when I had spoken to the producer at the time as well, that was driven by just, how can we get this to sell? Where you get it to sell when you have good voice actors. And they didn't want it to belong to a specific place. I mean, I find it funny, like Lenny Henry has a completely different accent to some of the other characters. And I don't know if that necessarily works or it doesn't. But again, it raises questions around authenticity and identity. And other people have written about the fact as well that this place is a place of everywhere. So it takes place in the forest, in the jungle, in the desert, around the water hole. So even the topology of the place, it's not one. It's an illogical place. It's not one Africa, this is East Africa, south of Kenya has a very specific kind of geography to the north, to the Sub-Saharan, to so on and so forth. And the fact that it's just everything is collapsed into it, which of course is, if you like, the criticisms again that like African animators or African filmmakers will put to the West is that we do that, right? That we just kind of like collapse everything and it's like, it's all kind of the same. And I think that's why, even though, like you said, it's witty, it's fun, it did lots of positive things, which like you can't take away from it. It was both an animation which was object of pride for the Kenyans and the Tanzanians, because they were so proud that this animated series was being produced in Kenya and that it's, represented, if you like, the creative talent in the country. But at the same time, also, something that they critiqued a lot for just not differentiating necessarily between, Tanzania and Kenya, and creating problems even between Tanzanians and Kenyans. So, like, this was on the blogosphere, like, everybody was going, I think you'll find it's not a Kenyan animation, it's a Tanzanian animation.
Right.
So there was, like, international politics playing out, but then there was also regional tensions sort of being played out. Yeah, it was quite interesting to read.
That sort of illogical space that you mentioned that the television program sits within, I think, on the one hand, the designs, which I wasn't familiar with the sort of the background of the Tinga Tinga style, but it makes perfect sense, that sort of reduction of imagery, and I mean reduction in the in terms of that sort of reduction is familiar from children's, book illustration, and that particular kind of visual language that allows blocks of colour to carry meaning, and those sorts of condensed images where I suppose in book illustration you have the attempt made to build the child reader's vocabulary through those kind of colourful visual references. whilst and through that pictorial brevity and that economy of representation. But I was also thinking about, in addition to those early, easily discernible signs and icons as stimuli for children's learning, which I think this program makes great use of in conjunction with that explanatory tone of narrative. How does a lot of the program titles, as you say, are how does this or how why does this happen? So they are pitched. It was premiered on CBeebies, but I was thinking about when in something like Disney's The Lion King, when they try and do there's a bit in I Just Can't Wait to Be King, the musical number, where they do this kind of expressive, illogical, chucking in all these African references and vision, and it just becomes this mixture of different, exactly that kind of thing, really paints that part of the world with a really broad brush without that differentiation. And this, I couldn't make out whether this program was leaning back on that kind of representation or whether it was a better version of that kind of representation. I felt like this is what Disney thinks it's doing in these really but doesn't come close. So I was interested in what you said about that, the illogical nature of the space, really.
Yeah, I mean, a better version for sure, in the sense that it uses Kiswahili words, that there are Kenyan voice actors, that it is visually located in a very specific region and with the arts collective. But I think maybe it's just, like, to give you an example, we were talking about our students. It's like when my students are pitching their visual research for a project, and they might pick a European artist and they'll name the European artist. So they'll use, name, surname, and say, oh, and this is the name of their work. And then they'll find an African artist, and they don't even refer to the artist as, oh, and this is Wangechi Mutu, who is a Kenyan artist, and this is her work. It literally is. And this is the work of an African artist. And, so there's this sort of the idea of authorship, where in the West, the author is the individual. But when they're referring to authorship to the other, it's just like, oh, well, we'll just generalize and put everyone together. And of course, what that says is that, you don't see that person as author of their work. And then in addition to that, you think that you can just appropriate their work, recontextualize it, and use it for your own purpose. And so, of course, that brings to the fore, like, the whole problem with appropriation and that discourse that African animators, Kenyan animators, Nigerian animators, South African animators, they're very aware of it,
It was an interesting one to watch, and it is, I don't want to be too down on it. I thought it was a really beautiful
It's
series.
great. But, I mean, as a
fun.
commercial project, it's just really good fun. And like I said, one of those things which is, it's important, and you have to recognize it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that probably brings us to the end of this kind of really, really whistle-stop tour. Hopefully listeners have just got a little flavour of the real interesting, diverse voices that might be out there that they could find out. This might be the third impossible question of the show, and if it is, I'm so sorry, Paula, but if people wanted to find out more about this kind of thing, or if they wanted to find more about your work specifically, is there a place they could go to? Do you have any open access articles people could read, or is there a website they could go to?
Yeah, so I have a blog, but it's not a blog where I write words. It's a blog where I just post links to African animation that I find online.
Amazing.
And it's just called, African Animation. I'll share the link with you later. Yeah,
I'll stick it in the blurb, and because we have a blog too.
But also,
we'll stick it in the synopsis for this episode. Yeah. So if listeners want to find it, you can access it on our website.
Definitely, I can highly recommend a website called African Digital Arts. It's being run by a Kenyan artist and scholar called Jep Chumba. She's been doing this, she's been working on this website for many years. It started off as a blog, but now it's quite a rich archive of anyone that's really into contemporary digital art in its widest sense. So animation, graphic novels, sci-fi, short films, a whole range of material that's coming off the continent that I think would really challenge those stereotypes that people might have of what creative people are making across the range of different African countries. Yeah.
Wonderful. We'll have to check that out so that we can plan some future episodes on some of the features we've featured here and some others as well, and really delve a little bit more into this vast area of research that we haven't even started to encounter on the podcast. And we've been doing about 80 so episodes, so shame on us, but it was fun to take on the start journey with you, Paula, and thanks so much for coming on the show and talking us through the basics.
Thank you, guys.
Listeners, you can find us at fantasy-animation.org. As always, you can access the blog and previous episodes of the podcast there. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Reddit. Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. Let us know some of your favourite examples that we've either touched on or not touched upon, your reactions to the films we've watched today, and more. Or you can do that on Gmail as well, at gmail.com, fananimresearch@gmail.com. Must remember to keep plugging that. Otherwise, that's been us for another week, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Tinga, 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 tinga. Tinga, tinga is a land full of stories and surprises. Tell me about it.
If you like to wonder why, Tinga Tinga is a land of wise.
You won't believe your eyes.